All right, we're a couple minutes after the hour, so I think I'll go ahead and get started on this. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Destruction of Rosewood lecture. My name is Katie, and I am the Special Programs Coordinator at the Orange County Regional History Center. If you've never visited us before, we are right downtown in Orlando, and we cover Central Florida's history from early humanity, pre-Columbian indigenous peoples, through present day. So we have about 12,000 years of history in our 4-story historic building. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our lecture. Today's program is made possible in part by the Florida Humanities and Historical Society of Central Florida. Now more than ever, public support of the Historical Society is vital to us, offering programs like these. You can find more information about memberships and donations on our online on our website at thehistorycenter.org. I want to give a special thanks to any members who are actually joining us today. This program is offered in conjunction with our newest temporary exhibition. Yesterday, this was Home, the Ocoee Massacre of 1920. This exhibition explores the massacre, the importance of exercising the right to vote, and asks that what lessons history can inspire for moving forward. The exhibition will be running through February 14th. So if you hadn't had a chance yet, I would highly recommend you come down and visit us and check it out. Hours and admission information can be found online on our website. Our program today is delivered as a webinar. So that means that audience members will not be able to use video or audio. We will save some time at the end for questions. So if you have a question you'd like to pose to Dr. Adejumo, who is facilitating our talk today, please feel free to put that in the chat and we'll try to address them at the end. Okay, so I will, without any further ado, I'll go ahead and pass things over to Dr. Adejumo. First, let me introduce him to you really quickly. So Vincent Adejumo is a full-time lecturer in African American Studies at the University of Florida. He teaches courses there on African American Studies, mentoring at-risk youth, Black Wall Street, and Black masculinity. Dr. Adejumo has been named Professor of the Year by the UF Black Student Union for the 2015 through 2016 school year. He was also selected as the Professor and Advisor of the Year by the UF College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for the 2017 to 2018 school year. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute my camera, turn off my camera and mute my mic, and I'm going to pass everything over to Dr. Adejumo, who I will remind Dr. Adejumo, make sure you unmute yourself before you start talking there. I will facilitate anything going on in the chat at the end, so please make sure if you address anything in the chat, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw it in there, okay?
All right, let me start video. All right, thank you so much, Mary, for that warm introduction. Can everyone hear me, see me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you. I'm assuming the audience can as well. Yeah, they can. They're saying yes in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So yeah, so we're here to talk about or to discuss the Rosewood massacre, and I'm happy that also the Ocoee massacre has gotten some publicity in recent months. I think it's well deserved. And hopefully, I know that there are people on the ground to push more for those residents who have been affected by the Ocoee massacre. So hopefully, we can get more done for the descendants of those people who got killed. And as we'll go further in this lesson, talking about the the implications of property in this lesson. So let's go ahead and start the lesson here with Rosewood, Florida. And I want to start with a video. So I'm gonna...
The country, but the Old South?
All right, let's go.
Than the rest of the country, but the Old South? That's another story and what the Rosewood Massacre is all about. 60 years ago, Rosewood in North Florida was a thriving little community of about 200 people, almost all of them black. Early in January 1923, some 1,000 whites came to town, and when they left about a week later, Rosewood had been burned to the ground. No one knows for sure how many people were killed there. The figures might be as high as 40. For 60 years, the story of Rosewood remained secret and was only uncovered recently by Florida newspaperman Gary Moore, who is writing a book on the massacre at Rosewood. Rosewood. There's a road sign proclaiming its name, but no memorial commemorating its dead. Located 9 miles from the Gulf of Mexico at Cedar Key, Florida, Rosewood today is little more than a trailer park. You search in vain for any sign of a slaughter, for any hint of the mass murder that took place here a long time ago. Well, what did it look like?
It's a big blaze. You seen things on fire. A big blaze, just burning down. Just burning up the whole thing. Just burning up my grandmama's house, churches, and everything. They burn up everything we had. All our clothes and everything. Yeah, they burn it up.
Why did they burn everything?
They was mad.
But you were just little children.
I know it. What did we care? They didn't care. They killed us. I was about 8 years old.
Minnie Lee Langley was only a child when she became a refugee. Now, she's a great-grandmother. At her home in Jacksonville, Florida, we talked to her about the place where she was born, Rosewood, Florida, the place that haunts her memory.
I know they killed my aunt, and they killed my granddaddy. Made my granddaddy dug his hole. He didn't have but one arm, but they made him dug his own grave. And he prayed, and they shot him backwards in the grave.
At Rosewood?
At Rosewood.
This is where it all began, in the white settlement of Sumner, just a few miles from Rosewood. Sumner disappeared in the late 1920s when a fire destroyed the sawmill. But back in 1923, Sumner was a booming little company town. James and Fannie Taylor had a home not far from here. On the morning of January 1st, 1923, James Taylor was already at work at the sawmill when neighbors said they heard his wife Fannie screaming for help. Fannie told her neighbors that a man had entered her home and attacked her, a black man.
She opened the door, but he just knocked her down, and she was raped.
Edith Foster was 16 years old at the time. She remembers seeing the few hundred white men of Sumner joined by others from surrounding counties, even from out of state. She remembers how they grew into a mob seeking revenge.
If he hadn't ever went in on this white lady, you know, well, there'd never been nothing to it.
It's not known for sure who attacked Fannie Taylor. Some whites say it was Sylvester Carrier, a young, strong-willed black man from Rosewood. Some blacks say the attacker was a white man. They say it was Fannie Taylor's boyfriend. But a lot of people tend to think the attacker was a black convict who had escaped from a nearby chain gang. Whoever he was, he touched off a week-long killing party.
They just, a bad crew come in here, and they just wiped it off of the map.
That night, around about 9 o'clock or 8:30, there they come in a car.
They kept looking for this Sylvester, but they didn't seem to find him. And then they went back up there that night and to talk to his mother.
Calling for my aunt saying, Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. And so my aunt didn't say nothing because she was scared too.
And that's when all the shooting began, you see.
They went to shooting all in the house, all upstairs in the windows.
These colored folks, you know, they were ready for it.
And I was sitting right between his legs. And he had the gun over to my right shoulder.
This was Sylvester?
Yes. I got down under him, and these old white people busted the door down. When they busted the door down, that's when he dropped them. He just drop everyone, come to the door.
He shot them?
Yeah.
Well, they killed Mr. Anders before he got to the house. They loaded him with buckshot right here. Killed him dead. They had to leave him there.
At least 2 white men were killed that night, forcing the mob to retreat. It was then that the black women and children, 12 or 13 of them, ran from the bullet-riddled Carrier home and into the woods. Minnie Lee Langley, 8 years old at the time, ran with them.
We had a aunt with us, so scrappy. She was just like a hen with a nest of biddies. She taken us to the woods, kept us out in the woods. She kept us out in the woods almost a week.
There's swamps out there.
Well, we stayed in there. Took it like a soldier and stayed out there in the woods.
You went through those swamps?
Yes, we went all out in the woods. And she built a little bit of fire for us to stay warm because it was so cold at night.
In the morning, the mob returned, several hundred strong. Inside the Carrier home, they found Sarah, Sylvester's mother. She was dead. They also found another body, a black man. Some people say it was Sylvester, but no one really knows for sure. What we do know is what happened next. The mob set the Carrier home on fire, and they watched it burn. And then that mob grew in size, it grew in anger, and it became even more violent.
You ain't never seen a mob like that.
Fred Kirkland was a teenager when he saw the mob rampaging through Rosewood.
They went wild. There was 1,000 to 1,500 people there by that time when they're coming in from every direction. And they was crazy. They give the high sheriff and the deputies 5 minutes to get out of sight and not come back.
They told the sheriff and the deputy to get out of town and not come back?
Get out of there. Give them 5 minutes to get out of sight.
And what did the sheriff and the deputy do?
They left there. And then they went to burning houses, killing people you never seen.
Yeah, Sunday morning they came through here, setting houses on fire. And as each one ran out, they'd shoot them, kill them. And there was a colored woman right here, lived just across here in the woods from me. And her name was Lexi Gordon. And she was sick. She had typhoid fever. And when she told her, the ones that was staying there with her, for them to go ahead and get away if they could, well, she'd just take whatever come, Well, naturally, when they set the house on fire, well, she ran out towards the back. And she had a back door, Johnny, out there. And so she made for it. And they shot her before she got there.
But she had nothing to do with
it at all, whatever. And, well, it was the way with a lot of them, you see. That's the reason it was such a situation that we just couldn't understand. It was just a mad bunch of men come in here.
What do you think they got out of it? Why did they do it?
Motive, I guess. Satisfaction is all I can figure it out. I don't know what it was.
Satisfaction.
I reckon that was it.
Well, the whole place was in smoke around here, And they said they had destroyed all the buildings. And said that there would be no more to live here no more, They couldn't come back and live.
Miss Langley, would you go back to Rosewood with us?
I would go. If y'all don't let them bother me or nothing like that. I don't want to go there and get hurt or nothing. Yeah.
You remember?
Hello, darling.
We brought Minnie Lee Langley back to Rosewood for the first time in 60 years. We also asked Lee Ruth Davis, Leroy Carrier, and Sam Hall, all survivors of Rosewood, to come back for a day.
Oh. Hello, Sammy.
Hey. You remember her, Mr. Hall?
Yeah. Oh, she looked just like this Morrissey.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, Lord, yeah. This is Marcy.
Was that what they used to call you?
That's what they call me, Marcy.
You
Yeah.
look just like Miss Virginia.
Yeah, my mother.
Yeah.
I'm bringing back memories that I wished I could get rid of. You know what I mean? This has been a hobby. If you just had been here to listen to all this and see some of it, then you would have known just what it was. We lost everything.
Lost everything.
You own the land.
Yeah, we own our land, all of them.
And no one ever paid you any money for this land?
No,
Just lost it.
took it.
What do you say to children today? Children like this boy, like your great-grandson, and people who didn't grow up when you grew up, and people who didn't go through what you went through, people who would say, this couldn't have happened in this country. Come on.
I would tell them like this. I said, don't never stay in a place that white folks can surround it. Don't never stay in a place that white folks can surround it. Because if anything happens somewhere else, they'll run you out from your home just like they did us.
Not many whites lived in Rosewood at that time, really just a handful. Among the few who did live here was a man by the name of John Wright, who owned the general store. John Wright lived in this house. It's one of the few that has survived. To blacks in Rosewood, John Wright was a hero. He opened his home to many of the women and children who were hiding from that mob. And John Wright did even more. He was able to get a message to the railroad that said, the town is on fire, send a train. And that's how many blacks escaped from Rosewood, by train. Who was on the train? You were on the train?
I was on the train. I'll never forget it. It was night when the train come there. It was 4 o'clock. When we left Mr.
4
Wright.
o'clock in the morning?
That's right. And he told him, conductor, to pull the train on to stop anywhere on the road that he saw women's and children, but not means, because they didn't know who the means would be.
If it hadn't been for this house.
We wouldn't have been here, because we wouldn't have had nowhere to hide.
Rosewood. You won't find an accurate account of it in any history book. Yet, about 40 people were killed here one terrifying week 60 years ago. When you think about it, far greater atrocities have happened elsewhere in the world. But Rosewood belongs to America. It's a real American horror story. The wonder is that it stayed secret so long. Minnie Lee Langley never even told her family.
I didn't want them to know that I was scouting through the woods and stay out there all night long, out there in that cold and all that stuff. I didn't
Running
want
for your life?
Trying to save my life. I didn't want them to know just how I come along, you know, through all of this and what the white folks had did to us, because I thought it was really mean. What they did to us was mean, and did it without a cause.
All right, so that's just the opening, and actually this video was made in 1981, 82. So just wanted to give an introduction as far as what we are coming here to discuss today, as far as Rosewood and some of the implications that has gone along with it all those years after it was burned down. So here's where Rosewood is located. So as you can see here, it's a little bit south of Gainesville and a little bit north of Tampa. And so that's very important when discussing Rosewood, because a lot of the mob who came through to burn it down and take over the property, they were from these towns surrounded, especially from Gainesville, and really from all over the South. So that's why it plays an important role. And also the location is important because, as you can see here, is right by the Gulf of Mexico. So a lot of the exporting of the wood, from the turpentine industry and other industries in that area would export from there, you know, because it's right by the Gulf of Mexico. So that's why it was really important. It's really important to make note of the location of the town. All right, so let's set the foundation as far as Rosewood. In the time, you know, it happened in 1923. So just a little bit after World War I. So we understand World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania, with the loss of many American lives, and then destruction of the American merchant ships and the German Navy. So in response to the escalating number of attacks against Americans and their property, America declared war against the Central Powers in 1917. And so of May. So the war years saw Black Americans further tyrannized by renewed racism, which was fostered in part by the policies of the Wilson administration. And we'll talk about Wilson a little bit more. But Wilson allowed his cabinet members, cabinet officials, to pursue policies that would further disenfranchise Blacks. And even when you're talking about Woodrow Wilson, that's who we're talking about, the president, it was even more so not just Woodrow Wilson, but also when you think about the federal government, you think about the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, and the allowing of Jim Crow laws being official in the South from the 1896 ruling Plessy versus Ferguson. That really put racism or allowed racism to be practiced not only just underground, but also above ground in the actual laws, at least officially from the federal government post Civil War, right? At a national level, we understand state and local municipalities had different laws according to their local jurisdiction as far as governing the separation of Black people, African Americans, and whites. But now the federal government comes in 1896. The Supreme Court rules that those laws are now part of the national landscape. All right. So now, in a speech on the Senate floor in 1917, Mississippi Senator James K. Varden warned that a return of Black veterans to the South would inevitably lead to disaster, right? So once you impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag and inflate his untutored soul with military airs, Vardaman cautioned it was a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected. So basically what we're saying here, again, America was in a time of war in 1917, but along with that, many African Americans were also drafted into the army to fight that war. But the problem is that many people, and especially politicians, saw that this could create a problem for African Americans asking for more rights, because they felt that they were treated with more respect, and they were abroad, like in France and not Germany, obviously, but especially France or Britain, in which those American soldiers were stationed. So they felt that if they come back, that they were going to be asking, those Black folk were going to be asking for more equal rights, right? And so that spooked a lot of politicians and just white people in general. So 100 years ago, Bud Johnson, a 36-year-old Black U.S. Army veteran who served in the First World War, was tied to a stake by white Santa Rosa County, which is in Florida, residents, and burned to death in one of the most brutal lynchings in Florida history. So he was actually burned in his army suit. And this is not a picture of him, but this is just an illustration of what, because people think lynching is just stringing someone up with rope, but no, it's just killing someone based on their skin color and doing it publicly, right? So when we think of lynching, that is what we are talking about here. It's just important things to note. All right. So from individual lynchings to sustained violence against entire Black communities, whites in both the North and South lashed out against Black Americans in a ferocious and often calculated manner during the years between 1917 to 1923, even before then, but especially these years. So from Chicago to Tulsa to Omaha, East St. Louis, and many other communities in between, and finally to Rosewood, Florida, and really all throughout Florida, as we'll get into a little later, white mobs, often in alliance with law enforcement officials and also KKK members too. Now, you have to remember, around this time is the second resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So that's important to note. So law enforcement officials, so they denied Blacks the rights and privileges that were accorded to whites. So again, practicing racism not only socially, in which Black people and white people just knew that, for example, that Black folk couldn't go into a certain area. It was both understood by both races, but also now the federal government co-signing that that you could separate the races, and not only just separation, but also that Black people can receive inferior service or no service at all compared to white folks. So racial tensions in the North typically erupted into lawless outbursts by white mobs against the entire Black neighborhood. So Rosewood more closely paralleled the violence in the North. And so this is very key to understand here too, right? So the North, the violence was typically associated with lawlessness, right? With white mobs. In the South, the racial tension, it was more so individuals getting lynched or killed, due to their skin color. Versus in the North, it was just outbursts, right? Entire towns, as we said before, St. Louis, Tulsa, Omaha, those towns. But Rosewood closely resembled the violence in the North. So recruiting efforts directed towards Blacks by Northern business people, businessmen, was a new and welcome development for Black Southerners. So moreover, Blacks could also vote and move about freely in the North. Now, I wouldn't, and so this is according to the writings of David Coburn. I would disagree with David Coburn here, where he says Blacks could vote and move about freely in the North, because if you study history a little bit more, you will see that even in the North, that Blacks were restricted as far as where they could go. Especially in this time, 1910s, 1920s. For example, you think of a community such as Harlem in New York. But even in Harlem, Blacks were confined to just that one space, right? And so restricted in that one space. And that one space typically wasn't the best space in which they were restricted in when you're talking about being able to, whether you want to talk about being able to grow crop, as far as if you're in the Midwest, or if you're in the North, it's more so the slums. It's a slummy type of environment. So compared to white people. So, and then also I would contend that Blacks could vote. There were restrictions on that in the North as well. And again, it depends on what city and then what. So in New York, in order to vote in these times, most of the time, you had to be an owner of property of some type. Well, guess what? Most Black folk were so poor in this time period that they couldn't afford to own property. So that took them out of the running to be able to vote, right? So little things like that was still prevalent in the North as far as the governing how Black folk could move about. So many African Americans thought that they had found the promised land in the North, and they wrote to their relatives and friends, encouraging them. They wrote to their family members in the South, encouraging them to follow in their footsteps. So at first, white Southerners ignored it and expressed satisfaction that Black folk were exiting. And for many years, white Floridians have seriously discussed sending local blacks to a foreign country or to the region in the Western United States. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. I did the same talk in Broward County, and it was amazing that most of the people there did not know that Broward County is actually named after a racist former governor of Florida, right? Napoleon Bonaparte Broward was a racist and a white supremacist. But anyway, he was born. Let's talk about him for a sec. He was born on a farm in Duval County in 1857. So Broward was elected sheriff of Duval and served on the Jacksonville City Council in 1901, House of Representatives, and from 1901 to 1904. So as governor from 1905 to 1909, Broward unified the state's institutions of higher learning under a board of control and was successful in draining and developing portions of the Everglades. Now, this part is very important when you talk about unifying the state's institutions, because, for example, when you think about a University of Florida and you think about Florida State, you know, typically they'll say, oh, these schools was founded in 1850 something, right? They say UF 1853, they'll say Florida State 1857, something around there. When really the schools were reorganized in 1900, or the reorganization process started in 1903 and was finalized by the time Broward got into office. But really those schools, like for example, University of Florida, it wasn't founded in Gainesville, right? And just as Florida State wasn't founded in Tallahassee. But a lot of that has to deal with Florida A&M University, you know, and, you know, kind of this gravitas of wanting to be before FAMU. FAMU was founded in 1887 on the same space that is in today. It was founded to educate people who were former slaves, right, freedmen. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it's very important this reorganization has some white supremacist leanings to it, because, for example, the state legislature, because the University of Florida was founded, not founded, but it was reorganized in 1904. It was organized kind of under the Freedmen's Bureau, and allowed it to get access to national funding via land grants, right? Via land grants. And so the state legislature, FAMU was also supposed to get land grants as well, but obviously they did not get the land grants. Part of the stipulation for getting the land grant was that the institutions had to let quote unquote Negroes into the school. Obviously, the state legislature wasn't going to let, at this time, the University of Florida be integrated with African Americans or Florida State. So what they did was they also made UF a land grant. They put it under this and FSU land grant by way of acquiring schools that were already had land grant status and putting them in this reorganization. And so what happens is that allowed the state of Florida to procure the land grants, but none of those grants went to FAMU. They went to University of Florida, not FSU. FSU is a land grant institution, but UF specifically is. And so they shifted those land grants that was meant for FAMU. Also, they shifted it to the University of Florida, and they did that for about 60 years. And so that's what, in part, that's why you have UF, you know, is the powerhouse that it is today, in part because of that. That's the foundation of it. And so, and again, it goes back to Napoleon Bonaparte Broward and all of the men, the white men who were in that legislature in that time period. So while serving as governor of Florida, Napoleon proposed that Congress, talking about the National Congress now, purchase territory, either foreign or domestic, and transport blacks to this territory where they could live separately. And so a document that Broward wrote during his term in office called on Congress to purchase territory, as we said before. So this is his specific quotes. So Broward says to purchase territory, either domestic or foreign, and provide means to purchase the property of the Negroes at a reasonable price and to transport them to the territory purchased by the United States. So, and then he says the white people have no time to make excuses for the shortcomings of the Negro. So this is Napoleon Bonaparte Broward talking. And so he says have no excuse to make for the shortcomings of the Negro. First of all, not recognizing or do not want to take ownership of the fact that the shortcomings of the Negro was due to white supremacist laws that were put in place by people such as him, right? And so you can find that document here as far as where you can find that. You can read that specifically if you want to jot that down as far as the URL. But that is where and again, that's the mentality at the time. And one may argue it's still a mentality that exists today among some people, right? That, no excuses for the shortcomings of the Negro. Well, what about slavery, right? Slavery wasn't too long ago as far as when he made these statements. In fact, people who still were alive in that time period were former slaves, right? Formerly enslaved, I should say. So this just shows the mentality of the politicians of that day, of the people of that day, and why Jim Crowism was allowed to live on for so long, because people thought this way. So as the migration escalated, we're talking about that migration of blacks to the north. And so migration escalated throughout Florida and the South in the years between 1910 and 1917. Racial tensions increased in both the North and South. So blacks viewed the migration as an opportunity to escape the oppression in the South. And so white Southerners worried that the migration was creating unrest and dissatisfaction among those who stayed behind. And so Northern whites expressed anger at the large black migration and its impact on housing, neighborhoods, and jobs, right? So the thing about it is that black folk caught hell not only from whites in the South who wanted to, control them or restrict their movement via lynchings and what have you, to control their behavior, to make sure that they're in that proverbial position of just remaining a boy, even if they're grown adults, obviously, but remaining in this subservient position to white folk. But also they caught hell in the North, because many Northerners, where you want to talk about Italians and some of these other ethnic whites who were at the time, who were also migrating in large droves to the North, they were expressing anger as far as the black migration as well, because they felt that their jobs were being taken by these black folk who were moving from the South, right? So again, black folk were being restricted not only from a policy perspective, but also in the social order as well. All right, so the Klan revival. So in 1915, the motion picture Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman. The Klansman came out in 1905. So this kindled a great interest in the activities of the first Klan among whites and sparked the revival of the second Klan. So President Woodrow Wilson at the time, again, this is a sitting president in office, and he said that the film was like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that it is all so terribly true, right? So if you ever, so those of you who may not know what Birth of a Nation is or what it is it's a movie where they depict African Americans in almost in an ape-like posture throughout the movie. It's obviously whites in black space, and they're depicting black people, specifically black men, attempting to rape white women. It's also a commentary on the political order, many of the whites, they have a revisionist history as far as the Civil War. You hear a lot of things as far as carpetbaggers and really if African Americans, since they won the war, then, it's almost like a Planet of the Apes type of situation, right? In that movie, this is what they're depicting. Very racist movie. You can actually find it on YouTube, and it's the first motion picture ever in the United States, and it was premiered in the White House by Woodrow Wilson, right? And you wouldn't think on face value that Woodrow Wilson was such a racist. He came from the academic sphere. He was actually president of Princeton, and so really one of the only presidents in the United States that had a PhD. And in fact, he was very renowned in academic circles. He's credited with being the forefather of the discipline public administration. So a lot of things with Woodrow Wilson, but again, very, very racist person. And so wherever the movie was shown, race relations deteriorated, and racial clashes frequently occurred. So the Second Klan spread rapidly throughout the South and into many northern communities as well. So the violence in Chicago, East St. Louis, Omaha, and several other northern communities left the dreams and aspirations of Black citizens shattered. So newspapers in the South added to white fears by publishing almost a daily litany of alleged racial attacks and rapes by Black men against white women, right? Even if those attacks or rapes were not true. So a day seldom went by during the period between 1917 to 1923 in which an incident of this kind was not reported on the front page. So such news helped sell papers to readers who had a lurid fascination with the violent and the grotesque. And so now let's turn our attention to the state of Florida. So in 1920, whites removed 4 Black men from jail who were suspects accused of raping a white woman in McClenney and lynched them, right? So that's a town in Florida. And then you have in Ocoee, in addition to the 47 Blacks who were lynched throughout the state, you had the Klan attack the all-Black town of Ocoee, Florida, in Western Orange. We're Orange County on November 20th, or November 2nd, 1920. So Brother July Perry was lynched along with 30 to 35 other Black folk being killed. So we understand that situation was because July Perry had motivated, was leading kind of a motivation for really that year prior in 1919 for Black people to vote, right? And so the local white folk and the Klans people, they didn't like that. They kept threatening them. They were threatening the judges in that area. And so finally, they on November 2nd, when it was time to vote, and you had all these masses of Black folks showing up to vote, it was a massacre. And so every Black person in that township fled, leaving it to become an all-white town. And again, the thing about this was that you dealing with the issue of property. All those Black people who had owned property, which again was a rare thing in that time period for Black folk, but you own this property, and now because of these massacres, you have to flee your property, and then you receive no compensation for your property, right? And just as they said in the video, those people who had to flee, those Black people who had to flee, they were basically refugees, and we understand refugees who come to America, they receive some sort of assistance. Political refugees who come to America from other countries, they receive assistance to be in this country. But those Black folk in that time period in which this lynching, the lynchings and the massacres took place, they didn't receive any compensation, right? So imagine you work all your life, you're 60, 70 years old, and then all of a sudden, because of racism and jealousy, you have your property procured from you. So approximately 2 years later, race relations took another terrible turn in the state when a white school teacher in Perry, Florida, was allegedly murdered by an escaped black convict in December 1922. So her badly beaten body was discovered by local residents less than 1 month before the Rosewood incident. So both black men were shot and then hung, although neither was ever implicated in the crime. So again, in the 1920s, you have this situation of black folk. It's open season on black folk, right? All right. So now let's get to Rosewood. So Rosewood was established around 1870 in Levy County, right? In Levy County, Florida, on a road leading to Cedar Key in the Gulf of Mexico. It is believed to have taken its name from the abundant red cedar trees that grew in the area. So Rosewood prospered as Florida Railroad established a small depot to handle the transport of cedar wood to the pencil factory in Cedar Key, and the transportation of timber, turpentine, rosin, citrus, vegetables, and cotton. And so in 1890, the black box, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Here we go. All right, I think this is that better? The black box, is it out the way?
Yeah, it's out the way. It's out the way, Dr. Adejumo. Thank you.
Okay.
Anything that's a box on your screen, we see as a black box on ours. So there's one right now kind of in front of that top bullet point.
Okay, I took it off. You can see it now?
Yep, that's good. Thank you.
All right. So Rosewood prospered as the Florida Railroad established a small depot to handle the transport of cedar wood to the pencil factory in Cedar Key, and the transportation of timber, turpentine, rosin, as we said before, which has a lot of different uses, by the way, citrus, vegetables, and cotton. So in 1890, the cedar depleted and many of the white families moved to Sumner. So 3 miles west of Rosewood, and worked at the newfound sawmill factory established by Kummer and Sons. So by 1900, Rosewood was a majority black town, right? A majority black town. And many, there's a lot of, many people say even how Rosewood established was that many of those people who helped establish Rosewood were formerly enslaved as well. So that's something to keep note of. So by 1900, as we said before, the population in Rosewood had become predominantly black. So the village of Sumner was predominantly white. So they're not too far apart. And relations between the two communities were relatively amicable, right? So you had most black folk in this time period. They also was working at the different factories that were in the area. So they worked along with white folk, and or they were servants of some type, so maybe maid folk and other types of jobs that they had working for white people. So it was mainly amicable as far as the race relations, although there was still stay in your place type of situation there. So 2 black families in Rosewood named Goings and the Carriers were the most powerful. So the Goings family brought the turpentine industry to the area, and in the years before the attacks were the second largest landowners in Levy County. So to avoid lawsuits from white competitors, the Goings brothers moved to Gainesville, and the population of Rosewood decreased slightly. So black and white residents created their own community centers. So by 1920, the residents of Rosewood were mostly self-sufficient. So basically what we're saying here is that the black folk in Rosewood didn't really need white folk to survive and to prosper, right? And so they had 3 churches, Rosewood did. They had a school, they had a large Masonic hall, they had a turpentine mill, they had a sugarcane mill, they had a baseball team named the Rosewood Sluggers, and 2 general stores, one of which was white owned. So the village had about a dozen 2-story wooden plank homes, other small 2-room houses, and several small unoccupied plank farm storage structures. So some families own pianos, organs, and other symbols of middle-class prosperity. So if you ever seen the movie Rosewood, and yes, there was a movie that came out in 1997, and you should, there was a scene there in which the white folks who were sitting on the porch, they were very jealous of Aaron Carrier. They were very jealous of him because, in part, because he had a piano, right, and an organ. And so you, in today's times, you wouldn't think that wasn't really, we don't think much of it, but in those times, that was really a big deal, right, to have a piano. So less than a month after Perry, Florida, following an alleged assault against Fannie Taylor in Sumner on the morning of January 1st, 1923, a group of white men descended upon Rosewood. So James Taylor, a foreman at Kummer and Sons sawmill, and Fannie Taylor's husband assembled a vicious mob and attacked and ordered tracking dogs. So the white community became enraged at the alleged abuse of a white woman by a black man. Again, alleged. James Taylor requested help from Levy County and neighboring Alachua County, where a staged Ku Klux Klan celebration was ending on the courthouse square in downtown Gainesville. So KKK members had been marching in opposition of justice for Black people in December of 31st, 1922. So again, all those different things that had led up to this, as we described before, Ocoee, McClinney, so all those different things leading up to this point. And then, so this led up to January 1st, 1923 Rosewood Massacre, right? And so even then, when you think about the, this alleged Black person was accused of, again, there are other accounts, as we saw in the video from Minnie Lee Langley, in which she said actually what she was implying, and even if you saw the movie Rosewood, and what they imply in that movie was actually she was assaulted. Fannie Taylor was assaulted by her lover, right? Who was not James Taylor. So basically a person that she was cheating on James Taylor with, and so that's who had really assaulted her. And so again, if you watch the movie, you'll be able to see that that being expressed artistically in the movie. So a telegraph sent to Gainesville in regards to Fannie Taylor's allegations provoked 400 to 500 Klansmen to head to Sumner at the appeal of James Taylor. So they combed the woods behind Taylor's home looking for a suspect. So suspicion soon fell on Jesse Hunter, a Black man who had supposedly just escaped from a convict road gang. So no proof of an escape was ever produced. So it also alleged that the posse forced Sam Carter to take them to Hunter. So when no trace of Hunter could be found, the posse turned into an out-of-control lynch mob and tortured Carter. So they riddled him with bullets, hanging him from a tree to be seen by the world. So it was an effort to intimidate people of color. So when the posse returned to Rosewood, they found Aaron Carrier and angrily pulled him out of his bed, roped him, tied behind a car, and dragged him to Sumner, cursing and ranting along the way. They cut him loose, stomped him, kicked him, spat on him. One perpetrator said, "He's damn near dead. Let's finish the nigger off." Sheriff Walker, "Yeah, no, I'll finish the nigger off." And so instead, the sheriff put Aaron in his car and drove 55 miles to Gainesville, where he begged his friend, Sheriff J.P. Ramsey, to put Carrier up in his jail and not tell anyone he was being held there. So again, so this is by the account of Lizzie Jenkins in a book, a forthcoming book that she has coming on the Rosewood Massacre. She's also a descendant. So aftermath. So on February 12, 1923, a special grand jury was impaneled to investigate the massacre. So after 25 white and a rumored 8 Black witnesses testified, the jurors reported that they could not find no evidence on which to base any indictment. So there's no indictment handed down for this Rosewood Massacre. So what had been a peaceful, law-abiding Black community had been consumed by white race and society distorted by race. So historian George Tyndall wrote in 1967 that Rosewood was the last of such racial clashes in the South, right? So the Black community of Rosewood never returned. So their land was confiscated under the fraudulent tax sales. Many left for other cities, losing touch with each other. Some never shared the Rosewood story with family members. Some changed their names, so they never, so as we said, we saw Minnie Lee Langley in that interview in 1981, she said she never told anybody. So think about the emotional strain and the PTSD that she must have suffered, and not being able to tell anyone that of this massacre. Think how much that had to play upon her psyche all of those years. Not only her, but all those people who had survived, who had never told anyone. They never received counseling for it. They never talked to anyone about it. And so these are things obviously we encourage today in our time period. But again, this was a different time. So they never received the proper treatment for having the PTSD from going through that experience. So as we can see here in 1982, so again, 1982, when Gary Moore, a journalist for the St. Petersburg Times, resurrected the history of Rosewood through a series of articles that gained national attention. And this is where the Bill Bradley interview comes into play. So the living survivors of the massacre at that point, all in their 80s and 90s, came led by a Rosewood descendant Arnett Doctor, and demanded restitution from Florida. So the action led to the passing of a bill awarding them $2 million and creating an educational fund for the descendants. So the bill also called for an investigation into the matter to clarify the events which Moore also took part in as far as those hearings. So we can see here the original newspaper clippings of the Rosewood, not the original newspaper clippings, I'm sorry, but of the original reporting of Gary Moore in what he reported on it in the 80s. So now let's look at Rosewood today. So today is now part of Cedar Key. So it's 98% white, 2% of mixed race, and 0% Black. So in other words, there are 712 white, 10 two or more races as far as being mixed, and then 2 Native Americans. So the home ownership rate in that area is about 66%, and the average value of homes as far as is today is $226,000. So I put these figures up here because imagine if those Black folk in that time were not disturbed and they kept their property, how much their property value would be worth in this time period, right? Imagine if it was not confiscated and it was, they're able to pass along their property from generation to generation instead of having to be uprooted and to go to various cities and start completely over with no compensation, right? Again, the compensation of the $2 million, that didn't happen until 1990, I want to say 1993, 1994, right? So the underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration, and so this is why I want to talk more as far as what the implications are of this today. If you think about the Federal Housing Authority in 1934 stated that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same community. So basically, whites and Blacks could not live together. This was in the FHA. How many of you understand what FHA is, right? You could use that to purchase, especially if you're a first-time homeowner. But this was actually stipulated in 1934, right? And so at the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who was mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of their homes be sold to African Americans. So so this occurred. This policy didn't end really until 1968 when they passed the Fair Housing Act to end the practice. But guess what? That still didn't end discrimination in housing practices. Right? So it was just done a little bit more covertly. and you had a situation in the late 60s, early 70s. Now a lot of white folk are starting to move to what? To the suburbs, right? They're moving out of the inner city. So what happens is that a lot of those real estate agents, they'll upsell more so to the black folk, and so then a lot of black folks can afford it. So you have a lot of them going into government housing, right? So again, there's implications there. So land, and so now when you think about home ownership rates among the races, so me putting up this slide is not to say that because of these massacres, this is the result of home ownership rates. Obviously, that's more so a function of systemic racism, which is part of that 1934 housing, federal housing authority. But what I am saying is that even today, we still have such an inequality, not only in housing. If you look at housing rates among African Americans, only 42%, among whites is 68%. And then we understand that with housing is where a lot of wealth is centered on in America. And so when you look at the average wealth of white folk, it's 919,000. So again, when we talk about wealth, we're talking about the culmination of not only just a salary, but we also talking about your savings. We're talking about how much your house is worth, your 401k, all those different things culminate into your wealth. While black folk are only worth 139,000, right, on average in this country. So again, these are things that we put together. We're talking about systemic racism, not only just the wanton violence in America and in Florida, but also the laws that were put into place. We mentioned 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. We mentioned 1934, the Federal Housing Authority, which didn't end until 1968, and even then, more covert things were put in place. So all of these things create these conditions in which we should be a little bit more conscious of. So the credit goes to David Colburn. He wrote the article that you can find here. Also Gary Moore, and then finally you can look up some more additional resources on in Rosewood, Florida. And so that is our slide for today. And so I guess now we will move into the question and answer.
Yeah, if anybody
Go ahead.
If anybody has any questions for Dr. Adejumo regarding anything in his presentation, please put them in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the couple that we've gotten so far. So the first is actually something that I will field. Someone wants to know if our exhibit on the Ocoee massacre is going to be made available online. I wish I had a definitive answer for you. I know that we have, our organization has discussed trying to make that happen. It takes funding. And I'm not sure what the exact status of that is right now. As of right now, the exhibit is not online. I know that they have expressed a desire to do so, but it just sort of depends on how everything shakes out with funding and that sort of thing. I will say that we have done quite a bit of virtual programming, that if you visit our website, and go to the exhibits page on our website, there is some additional programming that we've done in conjunction with the exhibit that is free that you can watch if you haven't already done that. So as an example, our chief curator and our curator of exhibitions did a lunch and learn presentation recently where they sort of walked through the process of creating that exhibit. All right, so Dr. Adejumo, someone had asked if you had any thoughts regarding, you had a discussion about reparations for the Rosewood descendants, and someone was wondering about Ocoee, if you know anything or if you have any thoughts on maybe why Ocoee survivors haven't been offered reparations, what could possibly be done about that, if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, by the way, I see the questions, and yeah, that Color of Law book is also a very excellent book as far as segregated America. So I actually have own the book myself. So definitely you might want to check that out. But on the subject of reparations, I think, and again with the state of Florida, and even with not only the state of Florida, but also with Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, those people also received reparations too. But again, this was like 80 years after the fact, right? Which by that time, most of the people who survived it died, and and then typically it's like in the form of educational things and that type of thing, right? But I think the reason why that reparations was not um, advanced as far as to the Ocoee survivors is I think it's the same reason why reparations was never advanced for African Americans in general in this country, right? After the Civil War, you had a situation where um, um, you had a general who had advocated for reparations and actually was giving reparations, giving the land of former slaveholders, was giving that land to formerly enslaved. And then Andrew Johnson came in and put a stop to all of that, right? Along with Congress, they put a stop to that. But for just a sliver of a second, maybe about a couple of months, Black folk were receiving reparations, 40 acres. Now, granted, those 40 acres wasn't the best of 40 acres, but it still was 40 acres. But so they came in, they put a stop to it. And again, I think it's just an overall thought of white supremacy in the sense of, people feel that whether it's politicians or just people on an everyday level feel that, oh, why is the government giving those people something and not recognizing the trauma that those people went through, and it was never compensated. Black folk in general were never compensated for their humanity, even existing in America, never compensated for the period of enslavement. So then you have these individual massacres that take place. Again, Rosewood, you had the descendants, they went on a different talk shows, and it's almost as if the Florida legislature was shamed into giving them those reparations that they deserve. And in my opinion, $2 million wasn't even enough, for all those people who lost their property and their livelihood and their descendants. But yeah, so I think reparations in general is just one of those touchy subjects at this point, especially for Ocoee now. And I mean, because even Ocoee, the history is still being discovered, right? It's still something that's being uncovered. And again, I'm thankful for this branch to highlight that and to have that. Then we saw the news. I think it was West 2 had ran the special on Ocoee massacre, so that was great. That was great. But again, it's just now starting to get the attention that it well deserves. So who knows? Maybe something could come up. I don't know. You see all these budget cuts due to COVID and all of that stuff. So, but hopefully something is done for those descendants and those survivors of that Ocoee, especially because it was a political massacre, right? It's a political thing. So hopefully something gets done.
Yeah, and I do know that, as more people become educated, so there is a House bill that was sponsored by State Representative Randolph Bracy to get the Ocoee massacre actually included in Florida standards for education standards for K-12 students, so that just more people will be aware of it. And so I do think that you're right, it is just sort of starting to come to light in a big way. Someone observed that there was a Klan parade right before the Ocoee massacre and also a Klan parade right before Rosewood. Is there any evidence that these were prearranged affairs?
There's no evidence as far as it was prearranged that they were going to burn down these towns before it actually took place. But what I will tell you is that because, again, it was because of the racial tension really at this time period. It was basically a tinderbox in America and specifically in Florida around the issue of racism. I mean, many people have this idea that Black folk were satisfied with their position of being dominated by the larger hegemonic society, and that's just not true. Black folk were trying to vote. Black folk were fighting back with their guns, and they were not just sitting there and just taking it from them. And so again, the Klan, they were protesting whatever they were protesting. I don't know why they would protest, because at the end of the day, they still was the dominant order of that time. But again, they would protest, and then but what I will say they did, as far as specifically a Ocoee, they did know, like I said, for going back for a whole year, that Black folk were trying to vote, right? And so 1920 election was a very contentious election. You had all types of things on the ballot at the time, especially things for women, especially. Women were actually were given the right to vote at that time period, I should say. You know, you also had bootlegging for liquor, right? So it was all types of, the 1920 election was a very contentious election. So they caught wind that Black folk were trying to vote. And now, when I made the argument that they planned the massacre, I can't say that as a historian for sure. But as I said before, what we do know is just so many things led up to that. And we do know that you know, they always kept their guns around, so they already had the mentality to want to do it anyway, because of the jealousy and just wanting to make sure that Black folk could not get ahead or make any sort of progress in society.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that brings us pretty much to the end of our questions. Someone asked, where can we get Dr. Adejumo's study or book again?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I don't have a book out yet. I am working on one, but I've written a number of articles so far, and I'm actually working on another one. And I actually have a peer review article coming out. So what I'll do is I'll forward the link to those articles to Mary, and then she could send that out and make that available to whoever wants it. Or you could just email me directly. My email is public, Adejumo3. I'll actually type it here. You can email me on my Gmail, and that'll be fine. So.